Welcome. 16th century Europe saw the development of significant divisions between Christians. The most well-known remains that between Protestants and Catholics, a rift that is less intense today, but which has also never healed. But there were other rifts too, namely those between the different Protestant churches, and these sometimes overlapped with political differences, such as how to define the relationship between a church and the state, and whether or not political authorities, such as kings, should always be obeyed. Today, we'll zero in on one such Protestant group, those termed by their opponents as Puritans. We'll begin with the origins of the term in the early Christian church, and then leap directly into the 16th century, when the term was redeployed as a religious slur. And yet, those insulted as Puritans had a profound effect, for better and for worse, upon British and ultimately upon American history. The word Puritan is one way of translating the Greek words hoi kataroi, which could also be translated either as the pure or as the pure ones. And that history goes like this. Before their religion was legalized in the Roman Empire, Christians suffered periodic waves of persecution by the Roman state. One of these occurred in the later 3rd century, and Christians were given a choice: either be killed or renounce your faith. The Romans saw their emperors in quasi-divine terms, and renunciation thus involved performing a religious sacrifice to the genius of Caesar. Christians who refused suffered martyrdom, but those who sacrificed were spared. So what if a Christian sacrificed and then regretted their choice and wanted to return to Christianity? Some Christians argued that sacrifice should lead to permanent expulsion from the Christian community. Those who advocated this strict policy came to be known as hoi kataroi, that is, the pure ones. But most Christians disagreed with their position, and the so-called pure ones were, perhaps ironically, put out of the church. Although orthodox in doctrine, they were schismatic in their approach to the wider Christian community. In time, the sect of the pure ones died out, and subsequent Christian history simply remembered them as an early Christian schismatic group. But of course, when we today talk about Puritans, we're really thinking about people who lived in the 16th and 17th centuries. And there's good reason for this, because the term Puritan suddenly appears in English sources in the mid-1550s. But it was not originally used to denote those people we now think of as the Pilgrims. Rather, it was originally an accusation that English Catholics made against those English Christians who advocated separation from the papacy in Rome. This was a hot topic in England at the time. In 1534, King Henry VIII had broken from the Pope. His son, Edward VI, who came to the throne in 1547, remained separate from the papacy. During Edward's reign, church ceremonies were revised and published in the Book of Common Prayer, or the Prayer Book for short. But Henry's daughter, Mary, a half-sister of Edward, had remained Catholic. When Edward VI died in 1553 and Mary came to the throne, she banned the prayer book and restored Catholicism. Consequently, some English fled to Europe, settling in various cities. It was among English exiles living in Frankfurt, Germany, that Puritan acquired its modern meaning. Disputes had broken out among English exiles about whether to maintain two things. One was ceremonies and worship. The other was episcopacy, a hierarchical system of church authority in which a local bishop oversaw the clergy in each individual church. Both of these were part of the Book of Common Prayer. Those who opposed ceremonies also opposed episcopacy, and they complained that the prayer book was too Catholic. In a letter written in late 1554 or early 1555, the Englishman John Bale described the opponents of the prayer book as Catharites. This was the English translation of Cathari, and Cathari was the Latin translation of the Greek hoi kataroi, the same name given to the ancient Christian sect of pure ones. Bale's accusation stuck, and soon enough the word Catharite was simply translated Puritan. But Puritans didn't like being compared with an ancient Christian sect. They instead called themselves Reformed. In time, these two terms became interchangeable. Debates in Frankfurt were also about political authority. As religious dispute grew throughout 16th century Europe, monarchs and other political leaders became increasingly involved in legislating belief and practice. Everyone at the time believed that religious and political unity reinforced one another. This was a belief at least as old as the pre-Christian Greeks and Romans. But what if your king or queen made religious choices that you disagreed with? Should you still obey? Could you obey publicly but dissent privately? Or were you justified in revolting and even assassinating the head of state? Some of the so-called Puritans endorsed this last option. They collectively authored a large number of political works justifying their position. Today, there's a collective term given to these ideas: resistance theory. It came in various forms. One was more mild. A good example here is John Calvin, who held that private citizens had no right to revolt. Rather, removing political leaders could only be done by other political leaders. From this standpoint, members of parliament could remove a king, but the local villagers could not. And in this, Calvin was hardly original. Thomas Aquinas, the great Catholic theologian of the 13th century, had said the exact same thing. But other resistance theorists argued otherwise, claiming that any citizen had the right to depose and even assassinate political leaders. By the late 1550s, they had even coined a new catchphrase: Reformation by force of arms. Soon, so-called Puritans, the self-styled Reformed, were permanently suspected of seditious intent. And because they used the phrase Reformation by force of arms, other uses of Reformation were now also suspect. And so, in the later 16th century, England polarized. On one side were those who maintained the Book of Common Prayer, its ceremonies, and its authority structures. They rejected resistance theory. On the other side were those who endorsed resistance theory and rejected the Book of Common Prayer, and therefore also rejected ceremonies and bishops. And as the decades passed, concerns about Puritanism also became a feature of political and religious debate in the Kingdom of Scotland. In 1599, the Scottish king, James VI, wrote to his son, "Cherish no man more than a good pastor, hate no man more than a proud Puritan." When Elizabeth I, Queen of England, died in 1603, her successor was none other than James VI of Scotland. Throughout his reign, King James made a concerted effort to root out Puritans in both England and Scotland. He had the King James Bible translated to get rid of Puritan Bible translations. He strengthened the role of bishops in Scotland, and he took the first steps toward introducing the Book of Common Prayer into Scotland as well. When James died in 1625, and his son Charles became king, continuing his father's work with the Book of Common Prayer became a lightning rod of controversy. Civil war soon engulfed the British Isles. These were, in many ways, religious wars. Notably, the phrase Reformation by force of arms suddenly began appearing commonly in print. Civil war culminated in 1649, when King Charles was condemned for treason and executed in a show trial orchestrated by his opponents. A succession of Republican governments, all of Puritan persuasion, kept the British kingdoms under military occupation and rule until 1660, when Charles I's son, Charles II, returned to England, restoring the monarchies of the British kingdoms alongside use of the Book of Common Prayer, which was now much more widely embraced. So what? So far, this has been a very British story, and yet the legacy of Puritanism is perhaps most clearly seen in the United States. Let's look at 3 instances of influence. First, and most famously, are the early waves of pilgrim colonists. The first wave left England in 1620, during the reign of King James, sailing on the Mayflower and settling in what is now Plymouth, Massachusetts. The next wave occurred in 1635, during the reign of Charles I, when another wave of colonists left England, settling in what is now Massachusetts Bay. John Winthrop was among these latter colonists, and his famous work, A Model of Christian Charity, described his hope that the Massachusetts Bay Colony would be, in his words, a city upon a hill. This phrase was taken from the New Testament, but it's had a very long afterlife in American self-perception. A second area of Puritan influence occurred long before the American Revolution. Puritans valued education, and New England quite rapidly became a major intellectual hub. In 1636, the Massachusetts Bay Colony founded Harvard College, now known as Harvard University. It was originally founded for a simple reason: to create educated Puritan ministers. 2 years later, in 1638, Harvard College acquired the first printing press in North America, and in time, Puritans would also found the Collegiate School, known today as Yale University. It was also founded for the sake of creating educated Puritan ministers. New England has long dominated American culture, not least because its oldest universities are the oldest in the nation and also remain among the most prestigious in the world. Finally, there's a third way that Puritanism shaped American culture, and that is through the United States Constitution. The very first clause of the Bill of Rights reads, "Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof." In terms of the 18th century, the key word here is establishment. The Church of England, sometimes known as the Anglican Church, was the established church in England. That is, the state church. Puritans actually debated whether there should be a state church, but they all agreed that the Anglican Church was wrong. By wholly rejecting a state church, the Bill of Rights made one Puritan perspective the law of the land. If you're interested in learning more, these books are worth consulting. First, there's no shortage of works on the Puritans. There are 2 thorough, up-to-date overviews of them. One is Michael Winship's Hot Protestants, A History of Puritanism in England and America. The other is David Hall's The Puritans, A Transatlantic History. Each author is a scholar who has spent a lifetime studying the subject. Finally, for an introduction to one of the many ways that Puritanism shaped later American history, read As a City on a Hill, the story of America's most famous lay sermon by Daniel T. Rogers. It's a detailed overview of how one simple phrase from the Christian Bible became central to American self-understanding. That's all for now. Thanks so much for watching. Please hit the subscribe button. Feel free to leave a comment, and I'll see you next time.